Hey sailors, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Janda, and this is Sea Lord Janda's All the World's Fighting Ships, Great Britain 1910 edition. This is from a save that was taken mid-war, but if you're new to these specials, what we're going to do is we're going to go through basically all the fighting ships of the world as of 1910, just take a look at what we're doing, what the AI is doing, and how the naval world in general is shaping up at this point. It is a little messy because this is a mid-war save, but we'll be alright, I think. So, taking a look. Also, we are on ultra-large fleets, so... Well, I'm going to try to keep this under 2 hours, but we'll see how it goes. There's a lot of ships to go over. Anyway, so... This is the basic overview of the situation. We do have the largest navy and the largest budget in the world, just about still, with the USA now up into second on both counts. Then, by tonnage, Russia, France, Germany. No, Russia, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, Austria, Hungary, Spain. Germany has definitely taken a bit of a beating from their multiple wars with us there. Phew. Oh. Excuse me, folks. Alright. So, of course, we are very early in the Dreadnought era, and we will get to the Dreadnoughts that are in service. As of March 1910, there are, 10, 14, 19, 21, 22, 25, 29 Dreadnought battleships, and 7, 9, 15, 20, 23 battle cruisers actually in service, with pretty much, probably even more than that. Based on how many everybody's building, I would say at least that many again building, if not more. But we will start as usual with destroyers. Spain has about 60, amounting to 21,000 tons. Those are, a lot of them are still the older 300-ton types, one 3-inch gun, 27 knots, 2 torpedo tubes. In fact, they mostly are. However, they do have a few that they managed to squeeze 4 3-inch guns onto, and some of which only go 26 knots, even though they're 400 tons. I don't see how this ship is in any way an improvement on this ship, but never mind it. And then, let's see. For some reason, they managed to build a 500-tonner with only 2 2-inch guns, although it does have 3 torpedo tubes centerline, so I guess that's the advantage there. And most recently, they are up to 600-tonners with 4 3-inch guns and 2 torpedo tubes, which make 27 knots. Honestly, nothing special about any of those. I mean, Spain's tech is backwards, and their budget is very small, so... the latest of these were built as late as 1908, which I'm pretty sure I was doing better than that by 1908. Oh, nope, I wasn't. I lied. Okay, well. Fair play. It's a pretty decent destroyer, actually, then. 4322. Yeah. I've got more torpedoes on mine, but we'll get to that. Austria-Hungary has 76 destroyers, which is more than us and quite competitive, amounting to about 32,000 tons. Really is, by tonnage, pretty competitive with any power in the world, actually. Now, they have plenty of old 300-tonners from the 1890s as well. They also have some of the 1342 types, but still 300-tonners. Then they built a few 500-tonners with 1342, and some with 2 but 3 torpedo tubes, and then 600-tonners with 2 3-inch and 4 torpedo tubes, and then some with 2 4-inch, 2 3-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, and most recently they have a line with 4 4-inch, 29 knots, 3 torpedo tubes, which is quite nice actually. It looks like some of the torpedo tubes might be side-mounted, but still, those are actually probably better than any of our destroyers. Obviously limited in numbers, but and they are building an 800-ton type that does 31 knots as well, so that's quite nice. So, pretty good marks for Austria-Hungary on all that. Japan currently has 80 destroyers, amounting to 33,000 tons. This would be also a lot of older 300 tonners, which are pretty much identical to everyone's 300 tonners. And then some with the 4.3-inch and 26 knots. And then 400 tonners, 1342 two tubes, or 2 3s and 4 tubes, or 4 3s and 2 tubes. And then they have a bunch of these with 3 4-inch guns, 2 torpedo tubes, and then new 700 tonners with 4 4-inch guns, 3 torpedo tubes, and 29 knots. So that's this is pretty much the state of the art in destroyers right now. But honestly, the bulk of the fleets that we've been looking at are mostly still 300 tonners. So far, at least. Germany, actually. 80 destroyers, 31,000 tons. They have, well, it's a large force, or at least, yeah, competitively large. Bigger than ours by numbers, although not by tonnage. But they've definitely taken losses in the wars. They have plenty of pretty basic 300 tonners as well, along with some 400 tonners with 2 2-inch and 3 torpedo tubes, although apparently they only make 25 knots, which is pretty dismal. Then they got 500 tonners with the same, but they make 29 knots. Oh, and 3 torpedo. The other ones did too. So yeah, the same, but they make 29 knots. And most recently, they have 2 of these 700 tonners, 3 4-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, 31 knots. So yeah, really, Germany's destroyer force is not that great. I mean, I would say it's lagging behind a little. That brings us to, it's very close between, the race for second is extremely close between these 5 powers, you have to say. Italy, 81 destroyers, 29,000 tons, which is good by numbers, not very good at all by tonnage, so let's see here. I mean, yeah, they have 300 tonners, obviously, which are, this one is 6 2-inch, but most of them are pretty much the same as, they have a lot of these with 2-inch guns shoved on, actually, but that only make 26 knots. But yeah, their fleet is mostly those 300 tonners, and then some of these 500 tonners with 4 3-inch and 2 torpedo tubes, 30 knots, which are not bad, although not very torpedo heavy. They also have some with 2 3-inch, 4 2-inch, and 2 torpedo tubes, which I don't know that that's better, and some with 2 3-inch, 4 torpedo tubes, 28 knots only. And they have 2 900 tonners with 3 4-inch, 30 knots, 2 torpedo tubes, which not that spectacular for being 900 tons, really, actually, because didn't we just see people like Japan had 4 4-inch, 29 knots, 3 torpedo tubes on 700 tons? So that's not that great for 900 tons. Anyway, France, 95 destroyers, 33,700 tons. Numerically the strongest force, not by tonnage. They have a lot of 300 tonners, as you would expect. Some of their early ones apparently only did 25 knots. Most of them do 26 or 27. Some of them apparently do 29, which is pretty solid. And then, yeah, that's the majority of their forces you would expect at this point. And then a couple of 400 tonners, 29 knots, 4 3-inch, 2 torpedo tubes. Some 500 tonners with 2 3-inch, 4 2-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, 27 knots. Or 1 3-inch, 4 2-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, and 26 knots. I don't know how that's not just worse in every way. Maybe these are not cramped, they're not short ranged or something. And some with 2 4-inch, 2 3-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, which these are 600 tonners, so that's an improvement. And then most recently, they have a few 900 tonners with 3 4-inch, 32 knots, 2 torpedo tubes, none of them very torpedo heavy. And for 900 tons, well, this is exceptionally fast, but that's about it. Then Russia, 87 destroyers, 34,000 tons. Good. I mean, very, what, like, third most by outright hulls, and second most by tonnage. So yeah, quite solid actually. They have a lot of 300 tonners, some of which apparently make 28 knots, but otherwise they're pretty much the same as everybody else's 300 tonners. There's not that much variety in destroyer design. They have 500 tonners with 2 3-inch, 4 2-inch, or with 4 3-inch and 30 knots. So that's not bad. They have 600 tonners, which 30 knots, 2 3-inch, and 4 torpedo tubes. And they have more than the average, these 900 tonners with 4 4-inch, 31 knots, 3 torpedo tubes. Those are quite nice. And then that will bring us to the USA, which has 92 destroyers for 42,000 tons. Largest force by tonnage, and second largest by hulls, so this is probably the strongest destroyer force. They do have plenty of 300 tonners left over in their force as well, of various classes, but they also have a pretty, couple of 400 tonners with 4 3-inch, 28 knots, 2 torpedo tubes, but then quite a few of these 500 tonners with 4 3-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, 28 knots, or these other 500 tonners with 2 3-inch, 4 2-inch, 27 knots, and some 600 tonners with 4 3-inch, 2 torpedo tubes, 29 knots, and quite a lot actually. I mean, probably a dozen or 10 or something of these 900-ton Dyer class with 4 4-inch, 31 knots, 3 torpedo tubes. So, other than weirdly they went back to a 700-ton class, although 31 knots, 4 4-inch, and 3 torpedo tubes. So they fit everything onto a smaller hull, which is quite a breakthrough actually for cost purposes. So yeah, quite a formidable force the US has there. Our destroyer force is not that great, really, consisting of 70 destroyers amounting to 34,000 tons, which is not very many hulls. Competitive by tonnage with everyone except the US. I mean, it is the third largest tonnage in the world, but not exactly overwhelming considering we have a pretty major fleet tonnage advantage on everyone. We have the Stag class from 1897, which is 300 tons, 1 3-inch, 2 2-inch, and 2 torpedo tubes, 26 knots, so slightly more heavily armed than the average 300 tonner, but also slightly slower. Then, in fairness, we don't have many of those really. I mean, 20 or something, but not by comparison to how many 300 tonners everyone else has. We also have a lot of these. I think the largest class in service at the moment is the Flying Fish class, 500 tons, 27 knots, 1 3-inch, 6 2-inch, and 3 torpedo tubes, I believe. All centerline? Maybe I'm making that up and some of them are actually side mounted. And then, most recently, 1905, the 600-ton Angler class, 600 tons, 27 knots, 2 3-inch, 4 2-inch, 4 torpedo tubes, of which definitely 2 centerline and 2 side mounted. So overall, we're lacking any of the really modern and powerful 700 and 900 ton destroyers. Our average tonnage, our 500 and 600 tonners that make up so much of our fleet, will do better than the 300 tonners that make up so much of everybody else's fleets, but we're falling a little behind at this time in terms of the latest in gun power and speed, particularly. Which is why we built the Fame class not long after this, but you'll have to wait for the 1920 fleet review to see that. And so then we go on to light cruisers. These are weirdly a dying breed in 1910. Everyone is focusing so much on dreadnought building, the AI more than me even, that they really haven't built any new light cruisers in a while. Some people are, but a lot of them have really not. Spain has exactly 0 light cruisers in service currently, with one 7,800-ton ship Gravina building. Austria-Hungary has 5, amounting to 38,000 tons, which is actually suffices to put them 4th of terms of cruiser tonnage, light cruiser tonnage in the world. They've got Gastein, which is 8 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 22 knots, 4-inch belt. This would be good, except for the twin turrets on the side are just weird, but I don't know if that's really better than just having casemates, to be honest, but I don't hate it. I mean, it's definitely a competent ship. And then Neustadt, 8610-3. Okay, the same except with no armor belt, basically, which does hurt it. And then Trient, which is the same but with slightly more of an armor belt, but not as much as the Gestein. And then two more Neustadts, so they're pretty much all this design, which is not that terrible, although the 1-inch belt is not much in the way of armor. I mean, you might as well just call it splinter protection, but better than nothing. Then Japan has one light cruiser, which is Naniwa. 4 6-inch, 6 4-inch, 28 knots, 1.5-inch belt, 6,100 tons. Well, look, this ship has exactly one thing going for it, which is speed, and damn, it's fast for 1910, because there's pretty much nothing on the water that can catch that ship. 28 knots is very, very nice at this time. She's as fast as a destroyer. And the problem is she does not really have the armament to match anything but a really terrible cruiser or the armor. So the use case for this is a little questionable. I would assume maybe this is probably picketing, like destroyer hunting. That's about what she would be useful for. And she'd be pretty expensive for a dedicated destroyer hunter, but, she could perform that role quite well, probably. They bought an American ship. Interesting. We'll get to that. So after Japan, Germany, also one light cruiser in service, the Augsburg of the Dresden class, 4,700 tons, 8.5s, 8.3s, 22 knots, 1-inch belt. Well, she is a veteran has managed to survive, what, 5 battles against us? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, she's survived 9 battles against my fleet, so I shouldn't trash her too much, but as you'll notice, most of those she was not actually significantly engaged or hit at all. She doesn't really have any armor. She's not that fast by modern standards, and her armament has just always been bad, so it's not actually a good light cruiser, although it is cheap. But fair play, she somehow survived, but the whole rest of the German fleet hasn't, so. Italy also one light cruiser, which is Terpsichore. 8.5s, 8.3, it's same ship, but less speed even, but more armor. Still bad. Really, if you're going to make a cruiser, it should really have at least 6-inch guns, in my opinion, but some navies would disagree. France. France actually has 8 light cruisers amounting to 45,000 tons, which does make them easily the second largest navy in the world in terms of light cruisers actually in service at the moment. They've got 4 of the Asis class, which have 10 6-inch guns in, looks like 2 twin turrets plus 3 to a side, 8 2-inch, 21 knots, 2-inch belt. Well, this isn't bad at all, you know? I mean, the secondaries are nothing to write home about. The armor is average, the speed is average, but the armor and armament and speed are all pretty acceptable for an older light cruiser, at least, which I can't really talk because all of my light cruisers are pretty much older. Not all, actually. My light cruisers are newer than my heavy cruisers, mostly, but these aren't bad at all. I like these, really, relatively speaking. Unfortunately, they then ruin with the Entrecasteaux class, which with 4 6-inch, 6 4-inch, 23 ounce, 1.5-inch belt. Look, it's faster, less armored, and no longer has a very good anti-cruiser armament, really, especially as for some reason they've now forgotten how to make twin turrets. On the bright side, they're 3,100 tons, which means they're very cheap, probably. And then 2 Quetlagons, which have 10 5-inch, and so are even worse, although they are fast at 25 knots, so at least they can outrun most opposition. That will bring us to Russia, which has 3 light cruisers in service. These are Muraviev-Amursky, which is 8 sixes, 10 threes, 22 knots, 4-inch belt. Well, this is much the same as the Austro-Hungarian design, yes, and it's quite good, really, still. I mean, I still find the twin turrets on the sides weird, but I don't think there's anything objectively super wrong with them compared to casemates or single turrets like I'd probably do at this stage. They're probably better and more weight efficient, honestly, so not bad at all. And then two Diana class, which are 6,000 tons, 25 knots, 8 6-inch, 12 4-inch, and a 2-inch belt. Good armament, except that I find it weird that so many navies have suddenly forgotten how to make twin turrets on their cruisers. Like, at least for the fore and aft turrets, surely. This has a maximum of a 4-gun broadside, where it seems so easy to give it a 6-gun broadside. But it's fast, reasonably armored, well armed, other than that. So this is not bad at all. And they are building 3 more as well. The USA has 4 light cruisers and is building 5 more. One of these is the 3,400-ton Chattanooga, 2 4-inch, 10 3-inch, 8 2-inch, 3-inch belt, 21 knots. I don't know what the purpose of this ship is. It has a lot of anti-destroyer armament, basically. Like tertiary type armament. But no real cruiser-grade primary armament whatsoever. Nor is she that fast. And she's very small. I mean, the only thing I can think that you might use her for, and it's a little sort of gamey, is but you could use her to... Basically, you could use her as almost a close to mid-range escort for your battle line, like to try and deter destroyer attacks, because she's pretty well fitted out for that, but she's still slower than them. But if she stuck close to the battle line that the destroyers were trying to torpedo, then maybe. But she's not going to be very survivable, so I wouldn't build such a thing. And then they have 3 of the Baltimore class, which are a lot nicer. 12 6-inch with 2 twin and 4 to a side. 14 4-inch, 2-inch belt, 26 knots. I've got no complaints at all about this. This is a very fine modern fighting cruiser class, actually. Probably the best I've seen the AI make, pretty clearly. Although it looks like they're ruining it because now they're building a bunch of 4,500 and 4,000 ton ships. Which will probably be terrible. Now we happen to have 20 light cruisers at surface amounting to 138,000 tons, which is about 3 times more than, somewhat more than 3 times more than anyone else has. Now, some of these are quite old, but, well, actually the light cruisers, as I said, are the newer type. They basically only break down into 3 classes. I just wish we had more, honestly, because fully, 6... 9, 12, 14 of them are the Sybil class colonial cruiser. 6,500 tons, 21 knots, 2-inch belt, 1.5-inch deck, 8 6-inch guns with, single turrets, 4 and aft, plus 3 to a side, and 8 4-inch. 21 knots, did I say that? Maybe. There's nothing super wrong with the Sybil class, even now, actually. The problem with them now is that they're too slow, more than anything else. And they were never really intended to fight in like a fleet engagement type affair. These are strictly colonial cruisers, the Sybil class, and you will see they are all on foreign station duties, and that is where they will stay. So they are very much colonial cruisers, and they do that job just fine. The main thing a successor class would need at this point is just more speed, which will pretty much come naturally thanks to technological improvements. Unfortunately, that does mean we only really have 6 fleet light cruisers. That said, I think they're pretty much better than the AI's fleet light cruisers, but we have the 3 Cordelias from the turn of the century, 7,800 tons, 22 knots, 14 6-inch, 2 twin turrets plus 5 to a side, and then 12 4-inch, 3-inch belt, 2-inch deck. The only place the Cordelia class falls short of the very latest rival light cruisers like the Baltimores is in speed, because they are pre-turbines, I believe. But their armament and armor is still excellent, and their speed is not really hopeless even in this era. Well, battle cruisers are the things that will really end them, of course, but well, for that reason, we've built recently the 3 Calypso-class ships, which are the same displacement and, frankly, pretty much the same design. 7,800 tons, 3-inch belt, 2-inch deck, 14 6-inch guns with 2 twin turrets plus 5 to a side, 10 4-inch. I believe we had to cut a couple of secondaries in order to accommodate the main improvement, which is the Calypso class makes 25 knots instead of 21, or 22. 3-knot improvement. And that immediately is sufficient to render this, one of the very best light cruisers afloat, and fast enough to keep away from most of the first generation battle cruisers. Battle cruisers are still the big threat to these cruisers, and I think that's part of why the AI has cut down on light cruisers so much. But there's also just really not that many battle cruisers in the world. I mean, there's like 20 total battle cruisers in the world, didn't I just count? And yeah, more are being built, but honestly, your odds of running into one at any given moment with your light cruiser is not that high, and you might have your own battle cruisers with to counter, so, I wouldn't have unilaterally decommissioned my whole light cruiser force. As you can see, I didn't. The AI pretty much did, in most cases. Not entirely sure why. So then heavy cruisers. These are pretty much alive and well still, although I'm pretty sure the AI is cutting back on them more than I am, but they're alive and well at the very least. Spain has 16 of them, amounting to 134,000 tons. These include the older Reina Mercedes, which is 7,000 tons, 20 knots, 4 7-inch guns, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 4-inch belt. Not really a heavy enough main armament. Speed is no longer very good. Armor is still alright. This was a bit better when it was built. Is now looking pretty obsolete. And even when it was built, the 4 7-inch guns was not a great main armament. 2 Reina Cristinas, which are basically the same, but with a couple of extra 6-inch guns, it looks like. Yeah, pretty much. 4 Lepantos, which are 7,000 tons, 20 knots, 6 8-inch guns in 2 twin turrets plus 1 per side, 12 5-inch, 10 2-inch, 3-inch belt. Again, the speed is going to cause them to suffer. Not that I have any room to talk, as most of my own heavy cruisers only achieve the same speed, but it is going to cause them to suffer in the modern era. Their armament is pretty good, actually, although some heavy cruisers have a heavier secondary armament, but it's a pretty strong main armament. Armor is not great, but not too terrible, so I don't have big complaints about those. Then 3 Balires, which are 2.7, 6.5, 8.2, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt. These are too small and underarmed to make good armored cruisers. If they were faster, they would be alright light cruisers, maybe. Although I would just standardize on a 6-inch gun armament also, honestly. 2 Santelmos, which are 4 9-inch, 12 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 8.5-inch belt, and 19 knots. Well, look, these are just flat out too slow to really be cruisers. But they also have way too much armor to be cruisers. I would call this a very light pre-dreadnought, or possibly just the pre-dreadnought equivalent of a battle cruiser. I mean, it also displaces 12,000 tons. The Santelmos here, I would say, are basically the pre-dreadnought equivalent of a battle cruiser. And honestly, in that role, they'd be pretty good. See, the thing is, just 5 years ago, these would have been pretty terrifying, actually. Because, well, they're not really fast enough to catch up with most cruisers, so maybe not quite that much, actually. Yeah, that always would have been their Achilles heel. Most cruisers, even in their era, did 20 or 21 knots, but if they could have just gotten the speed up a little bit to 20 or 21 knots, preferably even more, but up to 21 knots, say, then this would have been a battlecruiser equivalent, basically. As it is, it's more like a really bad pre-dreadnought, or just what it is, which is a really heavily armored but really slow armored cruiser. Which, in the fleet engagement where everything is probably compelled to stick with it and engage it, is going to really suit it well, but in individual actions, is not going to go well for it because everything can run away from it. And then 2 Conde del Veneditos, which 8,700 tons, 21 knots, 4 7-inch, 12 5-inch, 10 3-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Speed is fine, armor is fine. I don't really love having only a 7-inch main gun armament on an armored cruiser, but it could be worse, so these aren't that bad. And then 2 Almirante Oquendos, which 24 knots, 13,700 tons, 4 10-inch guns, 12 8-inch guns, 10 3-inch, and a 4-inch belt. So I guess this is the... When were these built? Just now. Okay. These being a 1908 construction is... just officially makes these pocket battle cruisers, or like budget battle cruisers. But they're also only, semi-dreadnought battle cruisers. Because they don't have an all big gun armament, they just have a ton of 8-inch to make up for it. Now, don't get me wrong, this thing will pretty much destroy, almost every armored cruiser ever built. I mean, it's faster than them, as well armored as them, and way more heavily armed than them. It's just that it's also so big and expensive that maybe you should have just built a battle cruiser. Because any battle cruiser with like 812s will tear this thing completely to pieces. Building this in 1908 feels a bit like just building battle cruiser bait to me, you know? Just a really expensive, delicious meal for a battle cruiser, because it's kind of going for the idea of a battle cruiser, but it's just too small to really pull it off properly. Even though it's too big to be a proper cruiser. Anyway, Austria-Hungary. 14 armored cruisers amounting to 129,000 tons. This includes 6 of the Lissa class, which are 7,600 tons, 20 knots, 6 7s, 12 6s, 10 2s, 5-inch belt. Well armored. Speed not so great, but not too terrible. Armament. I would really prefer 8-inch guns, but it's a lot of 6-inch, so... I mean, in terms of armor and armament, it's really not doing badly. It's just a little on the light side, maybe? Yeah, it is a little on the light side. Ships with 9-inch guns will definitely rip it up a little bit. I mean, my own ships have 4 9s and 10 6s for the better ones, so that would definitely take this apart. Not that crushingly, though. Then they have 5 Klagenfurts, which are 6 8-inch, 7,600 tons, 20 knots, 4-inch belt, 6 8-inch, 14 5-inch, 10 2-inch. I question if the side guns are really, really, really worth the tonnage, but it's not a bad design at all. There's nothing terribly wrong with it. Obviously, in the modern era, almost all these armored cruisers are basically meat for battle cruisers, but there's still not that many battle cruisers, as I've said before, so they're not that bad for now. Then they have 3 of the Budweis class, which are absolute monstrosities of 15,200 tons, 23 knots, 4 10-inch, 10 7-inch, 10 3-inch, 6-inch belt. Well, look, literally everything I said about the Spanish version of this, the Telmos or whatever, same all applies here. It's like a battle cruiser, but it's not good enough to be an actual battlecruiser. It will get shredded by a battlecruiser, but it costs not even that much less than a battlecruiser at 15,000 tons. And so why does it exist? Put it this way, if at 15,000 tons, if I could have two battlecruisers or three of these, or even two battlecruisers or four of these, I would take the two battlecruisers any day. And I do think that's the type of math we're talking about cost-wise, so why does this exist? They probably could have had two battlecruisers for the cost of these three. Then they have, oh, that's the light cruisers. So that's it for their heavy cruiser force. Armored cruisers, really, still at this date, mainly. Japan has 20 armored cruisers, amounting to 154,000 tons, which by weight and numbers is the third largest force in the world. They don't have so many pretty larger ships, though, not a lot of capital ships, so they're relying on these pretty heavily. They have three older Kasugas of 7,700 tons, 19 knots, 6 8-inch, 12 5-inch, 10 2-inch, 4-inch belt. These were not very fast even when designed. The side guns, as I've said, I'm not that sure of. But it's not horrific, it's just kind of slow. Even when designed. And then two Takaus, 2 8-inch, 6 4-inch, 12 3-inch, 20 knots, and a 1-inch belt. Very weakly armored for an allegedly armored cruiser. Not well armed at all either, so this is just too much economy. This is pretty useless. 3, 6, 8 Atago class with 4 8-inch, 6 4-inch, 12 3-inch, 20 knots, 2-inch belt. Well, I mean, same deal, really. Under armored for sure for an armored cruiser. Not especially fast. 4 8s is fine, but no secondary armament worth talking about. Basically just tertiaries. So, yeah. All these 6,000 tonners are too small to really be useful. Against other armored cruisers, anyway. And honestly, with 4 8s and 6 4s, this thing's gonna get chewed up by a light cruiser with like 12 or 14 6-inch guns. Quite easily, actually. So that's the most fundamental problem there. Of course, a light cruiser with 14 6-inch guns would be 7,800 tons, so there's that too. Weird overlap in this era there. Then they have three of these tones, which, okay. 12,100 tons, 20 knots, 4 10-inch, 14 7s, 12 3s, 4.5-inch belt. This is their attempt at a budget battlecruiser, and it has the same problems as the Spanish and Austro-Hungarian budget battlecruisers. Which is to say, instead of 3 tones, I could probably have 2 real battlecruisers. Hell, even 1 real battlecruiser I would take in a heartbeat over the 3 tones. So, yeah, why? It's not that I don't believe in big heavy cruisers, just you've got to make sure they're differentiated sufficiently from the purpose of your battle cruisers, you know? Like, these aren't really contributing anything that I couldn't get from a battle cruiser better. They're also not fast enough. They're at only 20 knots to really fulfill the cruiser killer, hunter killer role, so yeah. Then 3 Haogis, 9,600 tons, 21 knots, 4 8s, 12 5s, 10 3s, 4.5-inch belt. Now, these are not very heavy. For the displacement they have, certainly not, because I have ships with barely more displacement that are definitely more heavily armed, but they're not terrible all around. Then they've bought one New York class from the USA and named it Tokiwa, which it's not that good a ship. Little below average in both speed and armor, and really armament as well, so I don't know why they bought it. And now, oh no, that takes us on to the light cruisers. Okay. So then the major navies of the world, really. Germany is down to 9 armored cruisers amounting to 71,000 tons. I'm pretty sure that's due to their several wars against us, but they have 1 Blucher with 4 7-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3, 20 knots, 4-inch belt. Armor is fine. Speed is not great. Armament is really not great either. I mean, against a light cruiser of similar tonnage even, it would do quite well. but it's not a lot for fighting anything with actual armor, such as an armored cruiser. It's definitely not terrible, though. Then Stuttgart, 6,300, well, Nuremberg being the only survivor of the class. 6,300 tons, 20 knots, 2.5-inch belt, 2 8s, 10 6s, 12 3s. I mean, the 2 8s are just sort of there. Like, I mean, it's not enough guns. The 10 6s are really the primary armament, you know? And it's rather under armored. So this is quite unspectacular also. Then 3 Kohlbergs, which are the big ones, well, relatively. 7,600 tons, 19 knots, 4-inch belt. 6 8s with 2 on the sides. 14 5s, 10 2s. Well, I was more afraid of these going into the war, but experience proved that their lack of a really heavy secondary armament mostly caused them to suffer in one-on-one engagements, or has caused them to suffer in one-on-one engagements with my armored cruisers with heavy 6-inch secondary armaments to a much greater extent. They would get a lot more out of having 14 6s than they would out of having the extra 2, basically 1 to a side 8-inch guns. Then 2 Stralsunds with 2 8s, 8 5s, 12 3s, 22 knots, 2.5-inch belt. I mean, yeah, it's fast-ish, under-armored, and really underarmed for an armored cruiser. Then the 2 real monsters, the Graudens class, survivors, 11,000 tons, 22 knots, 4 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 8 3-inch, 5.5-inch belt. These really are monsters. They're just awfully big and heavy for a not super exceptional amount of firepower, but, well, yeah, because they're a good more than 1,000 tons heavier than a lot of my ships for not too much more firepower. They do have a very nice armor belt, though, so they're pretty tanky. I wouldn't put these in the category of fake battle cruisers, but then I would also say they're probably just straight up too expensive for something that isn't a fake battle cruiser. Then Italy, 17 armored cruisers amounting to 143,000 tons. They've got 2 Castelfidardos from the 1890s, 7,600 tons, 19 knots. I mean, it's the 8-inch, the 6 8-inch type with the extra 2 guns on the sides. I think I've explained my feelings on those at this point. And then 5 Strombolis with 6,800 tons, 21 knots, 4 9-inch, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 4-inch belt. Well, actually, honestly, these are quite. I would build this ship. I would literally build this ship, like, exactly, probably. So, to be fair, it's not really in 1910 very good. In 1895, it was, for that tonnage, actually pretty damn good. So, well done, Italy. Then 5 Volcano class, 7,600 tons, 20 knots, 4 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 8 3-inch, 4.5-inch belt. Well, a little more armored, a little slower, and a little more in the way of secondaries, but not very fundamentally different from the Strombolis. Not sure any of the changes made were really worth the extra 1,000 tons, to tell you the truth, so. Not necessarily an improvement. 3 Piemonts, 9,700 tons, 19 knots, 6.5-inch belt, 4 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 10 3-inch. I mean, same basic design again, but they've lost speed and added a lot of tonnage in order to pile on armor, which I'm not really sure is the right move for an armored cruiser. A 6.5-inch belt still, I think, doesn't really stop modern 8-inch guns that well. Let's see here. Is that 7-inch? Well, it's enough to make a significant difference compared to a 4-inch belt, to be fair. Which a 4-inch belt actually does pretty much nothing against modern 8-inch guns. I'm still not really convinced it's worth piling on all that tonnage and also losing speed in order to get, though. So, I mean, speed is life for a cruiser. And then 2 Varizis, which, okay, these are basically their proto-battle cruiser concept. Probably worse than average because it's not fast, and it doesn't even have 10-inch guns, only 9-inch, so really, I mean, this beats, like, my Berwick class, but it only narrowly beats my Berwick class. And my Berwick class is 3,500 tons lighter, so I mean, its main advantage is going to be the heavier secondaries and the heavier armor, but I don't think it's worth piling that much tonnage on just to get more armor and heavier secondaries on an armored cruiser at this point, really. I mean, those monstrosities are really going to be, delicious targets for paddle cruisers. France, 16 armored cruisers, amounting to 123,000 tons. I think maybe they've also suffered from the war. They haven't really fought me so much as they've been fighting Germany, but sorry, I think they've lost some ships in it. So they've got 3 Gloriers, 6,300 tons, 20 knots, 2 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 3.5-inch belt. And these are awfully small and light. Not horrifically so. I mean, basically the 6 inches in their main battery, such that they should probably just be light cruisers, honestly. They'd do better that way. The 8 Victor Hugo class, which are literally the same ship in every regard, so no further comment. 3 Tourvilles, which are 12,200 tons, 21 knots, 6-inch belt, 4 7s, 10 6s, 10 4s, and none of the 7s are even in twin turrets. I don't understand. Where's the 12,000 tons gone? It literally has less armament than, and the same speed as my Berwick class, which is 2,400 tons lighter. Yes, I think it has 2 inches more of belt armor, but 2,400 tons for 2 inches of belt armor on an armored cruiser? Maybe, but I am not convinced by how big this is for how capable it is at all. And then finally to Algerie class, which 8,500 tons, 20 knots, 2 9-inch, 10 6-inch, 8 3-inch, and a 5-inch belt. Well, and this would be why, because, okay, yes, a knot slower, an inch less of belt armor, 2 less 9-inch. No, but 2 less main guns, but they're 9-inch. And less tertiaries, but for a knot slower and an inch less of belt armor, but up to 2 9-inch guns, this is probably very nearly as capable as the Tourvilles, and it's almost 4,000 tons lighter, so I don't know how the Tourvilles got so heavy and expensive, but it's ruined them. So then Russia. 17 armored cruisers amounting to 124,000 tons. Not that crazy, actually. Russia, I've seen in the past build a lot of armored cruisers, but not so much this game. They have 4 Bayans of 7,100 tons, 19 knots, 4 7s, 12 6s, 12 3s, 5-inch belt. I mean, these are really quite nice. They don't have a big punch at the top end, but they've got good armor. Well, they're not that nice. They were nicer when they were built. They're kind of slow. They do have good armor. They don't have that big top-end punch, even though they do have a lot of overall guns. 2 Kinyaginya Olgas with 4 8-inch, 8 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt. A little slow, a little under-armored, and just a very unexceptional armor. I mean, these are basically just your baseline armored cruiser, or maybe a little worse than baseline armored cruiser. They're not that great. They are, however, better than the 8 Alexander Nevskys, which are 5,500 tons, 20 knots, 4-inch belt, 2 7s, 6 5s, 8 2s. And that's slow, average armor, just an anemic armament, very small for an armored cruiser. Horrifically underarmed. There are a lot of light cruisers out there that outgun this ship, and that's not going to cut it for an armored cruiser, is it? Then 3 Cosma Minims, their most recent Cosma Minims, their most recent entries. 12,700 tons, 22 knots, 4.5-inch belt, 4 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch. Again, I just don't know where they've spent all the tonnage. Comparing to my Berwick, a knot faster, a half-inch of belt armor, I think, just off the top of my head. Less armament, and 3,000 tons heavier. Where did the 3,000 tons go? Why is it so big and expensive? I don't know. It's not that bad if it were 10,000 tons. Although nothing super special either. But at 12,700, they've spent way too much on that. Anyway, the USA has 28 armored cruisers, mounting to 218,000 tons, which is clearly the second largest force in the world. And that would include one old Huntington, 6,800 tons, 20 knots, 5-inch belt, 4 8s, 10 6s, 12 3s. Pretty standard early armored cruiser. Slow by modern standards, not super fast by their standards then either. Good armor. Average, very average armament, but nothing wrong with it. 2 Salt Lake Cities, which are identical. Yep, completely identical. Don't know why they're a different class. 4 Seattles, which are 2 8-inch and have an inch less, inch and a half less. So they drop 2 8-inch guns and an inch and a half of belt to save 500 tons. I think that is almost certainly a dumb choice, but okay. Because that just makes them quite noticeably less protected and a lot less heavy hitting power. Halved. And then for Houston class, which with 2 7s, 6 5s, 8 2s, 20 knots, 3.5-inch belt, are useless and outgunned by most light cruisers, so trash. For Indianapolis class, which have 4 7-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 20 knots, 4-inch belt. Speed, below average, not horrific. Armor, average. Armament, I mean, it's again this type that's like really depending more on the 6-inch guns and just kind of slightly underarmed overall. I would just really like to see 8-inch guns there instead, and the jump is pretty big, I think. For Vincennes class, which 8 7-inch, 10 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 22 knots, 4-inch belt, 9,800 tons. Well, the 8 7s is quite a firepower boost, albeit they're side turrets rather than main turrets, or rather than fore and aft. So they have basically a 6-gun, 7-inch broadside, plus presumably 5 6s, so call it an 11-gun broadside. I mean, it's pretty heavy firepower. They don't have any really big guns, though, but it's a different take. I don't hate it. It's not what I would build, but I don't hate it. For Phoenix class, 14 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 11,200 tons, 19 knots, 5.5-inch belt. This should probably just be a light cruiser. Well, except it's so damn heavy. Again, it's rather slow. Well armored, but rather slow. It doesn't have any big guns, just all these 6 inches. And it's so heavy, really, for not having any big guns and not having any speed either. I don't think the armor prioritizing armored cruisers are great ideas overall, probably. And then we have 5 Masuda class, 8,000 tons, 22 knots, 3-inch belt, 12 7s, 10 4s. Looks like that's probably twin turrets, then basically a 9, no, not a 9, an 8-gun broadside. Yeah. 4 to a side, plus 4 in the turrets. Well, it's fairly fast. It's got 8 7-inch guns as a broadside, 3-inch belt, little under armored, not terrible. I don't hate this either. It's just not how I would build, but it's not at all bad. This lots of mid-caliber guns is not a terrible idea at all, with how hard it is to get hits these days, although it's getting much easier by 1910, but it was not so easy. Well, shouldn't let them get away with that. These were built only 5 years ago, but Until recently, it's been very hard to get hits, and you can see how you would draw the conclusion that a lot of mid-sized guns might be one of the ways to do it. So then we have 32 armored cruisers amounting to 302,000 tons, which does mean the largest force in the world, albeit, fair warning, I'm very unsatisfied overall with our armored cruiser force at this point. We have no less than 8 Argonaut-class armored cruisers, which are legacy ships, 9,100 tons, 21 knots, 2 9-inch, 12 6-inch, 16 3-inch, a 4-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Their speed and armor are really not that bad, although they've all lost. Actually, no. For some reason, these haven't lost speed if you look over on the left here, but they should be losing speed due to the age of their engines. Maybe I refitted their engines at some point? Can't quite remember. I might have. They've been through at least 2 refits. Their armament is still not terrible. It's not that great, but it's not that terrible, although I think the guns are pretty old now. Honestly, compared to everyone else's armored cruisers, it's not that the Argonauts hold up that badly, although they're not that special either. But they're definitely showing their age by now. Now, then there were 8 of the Drake class, which are 9,800 tons, 21 knots, 4 9-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 4-inch belt, 2-inch deck. These have a little bit more in the way of heavy firepower, although, what, a little bit less in the way of 6-inch firepower, so it's still more firepower, but a trade-off. Speed is decent, or was. They've mostly dropped to 19 knots by now. Armor is decent. To be fair, with all the old armored cruisers of the other powers, you should also probably assume they've lost a knot or 2 by this point. But, it's not that they're terrible, but they're definitely old. There's nothing really wrong with them when they were built, although they weren't anything super duper special, but they were good. And they're still good considering the AI hasn't really built anything groundbreaking, mostly. Although one of those proto-battlecruiser type things would certainly shred them. But, I mean, they need replacement fairly soon. And then 6 Terpsichores. These were not supposed to be heavy cruisers, I will say flat out. But with 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 8,900 tons, 21 knots, 4-inch belt, 2-inch deck. These were just built as a very heavy class of light cruisers, but had to be refitted into armored cruisers in order to get better fire control on them at some point. Because of, I believe, a game update that meant due to armor quantity, I think, they couldn't be classified as light cruisers anymore. So that has kind of screwed them over. They would still be pretty damn competitive as light cruisers, not perfect, but competitive. But as armored cruisers, I'll be the first to say their speed and armor are fine, actually, but their armament is just definitively underwhelming because they really don't have any heavy gun punch. And then most recently, we have 4, 8, 10 of the Berwick class, which are 9,800 tons, 21 knots, 4 9-inch, 10 6-inch, 12 3-inch, 5-inch belt, 2-inch deck. The only real difference between these and the Drakes is that these have, I believe, an extra inch of belt armor, which is probably not the thing that has aged. I don't think it was possible to get more speed out of them, and even if it had been, they would need like 25 knots to have really aged well now. But these aren't necessarily terrible either, but they're basically the same as the Drakes, to be fair. They're pretty well armored, their speed is decent, their guns are honestly decent except against the super big ships. It's just, they're definitely very vulnerable to battle cruisers now. And you'll notice the last of those was built in 1899. It's already been over 10 years since we built a new armored cruiser, and we really, really are in need of a pretty wholesale replacement of this force. However, just having gone through what the AI has, other than the proto battlecruiser type designs, there's still not really anything much better than the Berwicks and Drakes, so we're not in that horrible a position. Now, as of 1910, pre-dreadnoughts still kind of rule the waves. I mean, they are by far the most numerous capital ships still, We, for instance, have 30 pre-dreadnoughts and 5 dreadnoughts. Even the powers that have built a lot of dreadnoughts very quickly, like Germany has the most right now, still has 23 pre-dreadnoughts to 10 dreadnoughts. So they definitely bear looking at. Still, by 1920, they will mostly have disappeared, but right now there's still a lot of them at sea. Like, what? That's over 100 right between those 4 alone, so there's probably almost like 200 of them or something at sea. Sorry. Don't mind that it's 2 a.m. And we're an hour in, so we should be able to get this done in another hour, hopefully. Spain, 8 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 73,000 tons. They've got the 3 Intrepidos, which are, I'm going to tell you right now, at a glance, god-awful. Absolute trash. I have armored cruisers that would rip these to shreds. 7,000 tons, 17 knots, 8.5-inch belt, 4 10-inch guns, 6.4, 8.3. Anemic secondary and tertiary armament, really. Very small main guns for a battleship. Not especially fast. Not terribly, terribly slow, because there's plenty of 16-knot pre-dreadnoughts, but the armor is also very bad, so legitimately a Berwick-class armored cruiser would have, if it could get to close range, a very good fighting chance against this. And one of those proto-battlecruiser ones would actually shred it. Obviously, its chances against all pre-dreadnoughts' chances against any actual dreadnought are pretty much nil, but yeah. These are not good. They are probably, however, better than the 4 Alejandro I, which at 9,800 tons, 17 knots, 7.5-inch belt, 4 8-inch guns, 12 6s, 10 3s. These have the armament of an armored cruiser, more armor than an armored cruiser, but much slower. So any actual, I mean, they have the speed of a battleship. They very much do not have the armor or armament of a battleship. So they cannot outrun a battleship, and they will be shredded by any battleship. So what the hell they exist for, I don't know. And most recently, they have Príncipe de Asturias, which 12,700 tons, 18 knots, 8-inch belt, 4 11-inch guns, 12 6, 10 3. Look, this is a less horrific effort. It's still badly underarmed. Speed is alright. For a pre-dreadnought, pretty good, actually. Guns are not so bad. I mean, armor is the biggest problem with this ship, but still not good, really. Then Austria has 14 pre-dreadnoughts, amounting to 144,000 tons. 2 Erzurhog Karls, which are 9,000 tons, 16 knots, 8.5-inch belt, 4 10-inch guns. We're going to go ahead and stop right there. Complete garbage. Worthless. Trash. Horrific. Yeah, it's not fast even for a battleship. It's badly armored. And it's got a pathetic armament. Again, there are armored cruisers, numerous armored cruisers around the world that would beat this battleship in a fight. That's not where you want to be with your battleship. Then they've got 7 Tegethoff class, 9,000 tons, 16. Okay, these are the same ship. This is the same ship. It's just as bad as the last one. It has what? No, it's changed up the secondaries. It's made them worse. 8 4-inch instead of 6 6-inch, and 14 2-inch still, and it's gained half an inch of belt armor. It's still trash. It's not better. All right. Then 5 Kronprinzessin Erzurhogin Stephanie, 12,600 tons, 20 knots, 11-inch belt, 4 9-inch, 12 6-inch, 12 3-inch. This is not a battleship. It is, however, a very, very good armored cruiser. Because it has the speed of an armored cruiser. It has way more armor. I mean, it has the armor of a battleship. the reason it's not a battleship is because it doesn't have anywhere near the armament of any decent battleship, and it would absolutely lose a fight to any decent battleship with actual 11 or 12-inch guns. But as a very expensive armored cruiser, it would do quite nicely. As a battleship, no. Um, Japan. Japan has 15 battleships amounting to 131,000 tons, pre-dreadnoughts, that is. The oldest, Asahi, 11,000 tons, 18 knots, 8-inch belt, 4 10-inch, 14 6-inch, 10 3-inch. Look, speed's alright. Armor and armament are both very bad. So that's, yeah, that's pretty much that. Armor and armament are both very bad. 10-inch is better than 9-inch at least, but, like, no. Still not good. And then two Sagami class, which 6,000 tons, 17 knots, 4 10-inch, 10 4-inch, 10 3-inch, 6.5-inch belt. Look, this barely has better armor than an armored cruiser. It's significantly slower than an armored cruiser. It barely has a better armament than an armored cruiser. Probably because it's only 6,000 tons. Let's just say these are coast defense ships instead of battleships, to be nice, and call it a day on them. 3 Katori class, 10,500 tons, 19 knots, 4 10-inch, 8.6, 8.3, 10.5-inch belt. Look. Fair play. It's fast for a battleship. It's pretty well armored. Not really great, but pretty good at least. It's in the right weight class. Its armament is still very weak for a battleship, really. This might kind of do alright against armored cruisers, considering it's almost as fast as a lot of them. But it will not do well against real battleships, still. 3 Suo class. 6,400 tons, 20 knots. 4 8-inch, 10 6-inch, 10 3-inch, 6.5-inch belt. This is a heavy armored cruiser. Heavy in armor. Reasonable speed. It's honestly a pretty good armored cruiser. To squeeze a 6.5-inch belt plus 20 knots plus 4 8, 10 6, 10 3 onto 6,400 tons is actually pretty damn well done, and it would be a quite cost-effective armored cruiser. The only problem is that it's categorized as a battleship and is going to get absolutely wrecked by any actual battleship if they try to use it as a battleship. Oh, and they have 3 more of them too, that's nice. So 6 of those. Almost more than a third of their pre-dreadnought forces, those. And 3 Akis, which are their only actual pre-dreadnought battleships. 12,800 tons, 17 knots, 4 12s, 12 7s, 22s, 9.5-inch belt. Armor's a little on the weak side, speed is pretty decent. Armament is honestly pretty solid. 4 12s is pretty much the baseline. 12 7s is actually quite a heavy secondary armament, so I'm pretty satisfied with the Aki class. It's a shame they only have 3 of them out of their 15 alleged pre-dreadnoughts, most of which are really armored cruisers or coast defense ships. Germany. Germany has 23 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 260,000 tons, which is not really doing that great, and that's partially significantly my fault, really, but yeah, due to our battles. But they've got 3 Preußens. Well, actually, I don't think they've lost that many pre-dreadnoughts against me, so it's well, they've lost several in the one big battle involving France, and France has sunk several, so yeah. The wars have definitely cut these down somewhat. Anyway, 3 Preußens, 12,000 tons, 17 knots, 8.5-inch belt, 4 10s, 14 5s, 10 3s. These are... speed is alright, armor and armament are both very bad for a battleship, so these are more like... they're pretty big and expensive, you know, really, but they're really just not very good. Their armor and armament are quite bad, so those are pretty bad. 5 Deutschland class with 10,800 tons, 70 knots, 10-inch belt, 4 11-inch, 8 4-inch, 8 3-inch. Honestly, these are better. Speed is the same. Armor is, what, 2 inches thicker? 1.5 inches. And heavier main guns. Yes, the secondaries and tertiaries are both very bad, but with a battleship, I mean, okay, with pre-dreadnoughts, secondaries count more, but for strict battleship against, as long as we're talking 5-inch and 4-inch, it doesn't really matter that much for battleship versus battleship encounters. It's when you start piling on 7 and 8 and 9-inch guns and better that it starts counting a little more. So for battleship versus battleship engagements, this is just better armored and really better armed as well, and lighter. So I would rate the Deutschlands a lot higher than the Preußens. Then one Westfalen, which is apparently under construction, but it looks like it's got 4 10s and is only 9,100 tons. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's terrible. 7 Ostfrieslands, which are 10,900 tons, 17 knots, 4 10-inch, 10 6-inch, 8 2-inch, 11-inch belt. Look, speed is fine. Armor is fine. Armament, not fine. Germany, please stop underarming all of your ships. Honestly, for the love of Neptune. Really, though, 410s is just not going to compete with 412s, and it's not anything to write home about in terms of secondaries either. Speed and armor are good, though, so it's not complete trash. And then they have 6 Badens, which are basically, they were going to build another class, but probably got canceled when Dreadnoughts started happening. 11,900 tons, 18 knots, 411, 10-7, 12-3, 7-inch belt. Well, oh, that's where it's ruined, isn't it? I was almost happy. It's pretty fast. The armament is pretty decent. I would say 11s are at least in the category where, that's a real battleship's armament. It's just Germany being Germany, putting it lighter guns than average, but it's pretty decent. 10-7s is also a heavy enough secondary armament to maybe have some impact in a battleship-on-battleship combat. The armor, however, is complete trash for a battleship, and that kind of ruins it, yeah. And then they have 1 Kronprinz, which 16,700 tons, 18 knots, 4 11-inch guns, 12 8-inch, 16 4-inch, and 11-inch belt. Oh, look, they finally got it, too. It's fast. It's well armored. Reasonably so. Compared to what the AI generally does, yeah, it's well armored. And pretty well armed. It's a heavy secondary battery, semi-dreadnought type thing, and a reasonable primary battery. Not what I would pretty much always go for 12s, but it's a reasonable primary battery. So they finally nailed it with the Kronprinz class. It's just a shame they only built 1 and then transitioned to dreadnoughts, but maybe they carried over the experience. Maybe. So that Italy, 24 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 290,000 tons. That would be Italia, 11,900 tons, 15 knots, 6-inch belt, 4 12s, 8 8s, and 16 4s. What the hell? Okay, it's quite slow, even for a pre-dreadnought. It's really badly armored, even for a pre-dreadnought. And you gotta think being built in 1891, that's just like basic iron or something, or compound at best. Certainly not Krupp cement. It's got a really heavy armament, like a semi-dreadnought level armament, although the guns are definitely very old. But yeah, the speed and armor are too pathetic for the armament to say for, especially as the armament is probably very old now. That said, it's definitely got a punch. Re Umbertos, 3 of them, 13,400 tons, 20 knots, 7-inch belt, 4 12s, 10 7s, 10 4s. This is an early battle cruiser, kind of. It's pretty much as fast as most of the cruisers from the period she was built in. It's got armor that's barely better than armored cruisers, but worse than a battleship should have, for sure. But it very much has the armament of a battleship, a pretty powerful battleship, actually, with 4 12s and 10 7s for a secondary, so these would not stand up well in the line of battle against other battleships, and because they are battleships, they're going to get class thrown into the line of battle against other battleships. But if a player had them and was to use them as battle cruisers, they would probably do quite well. Weirdly enough. Then they have 7 Amaraglio St. Bons, 10,800 tons, 18 knots, 11-inch belt, 4 10s, 8 6s, 8 4s. Speed is great. Armor is fine. Guns are bad. It's really just undergunned, unfortunately. 2 Cristoforo Columbus, 7,800 tons, 18 knots, 410, 6683, 8.5-inch belt. Speed is great. Armament is bad. Armor is bad. It's just too small to make a good battleship. You can't build a good battleship on 7,800 tons. And then 6 of the Littorio class, 14,900 tons, 16 knots, 413-inch, 10.7, 14.2, and a 10-inch belt. Speed is unexceptionable, but not terrible. Armor is also below average, but, well, maybe not below the AI's average, but below what I think of as average. But not terrible. And armament is quite heavy, so, you know, it's a pretty decent battleship. 13-inch guns are a relatively early push to those, and definitely adds some punch. Then we have the one-off Claudio Druso, which is a slow armored cruiser. 10,000 tons, 18 knots, 4.9, 10.6, 16.3, 8-inch belt. It's straight up got the armament of an armored cruiser. It's not fast enough to be an armored cruiser, but it's also too well armored to be an armored cruiser, so I don't really know what the role of this ship is, but it's definitely not to be a battleship. Let's put it that way. And finally, 4 Pompeo Magnos. 11,900 tons, 18 knots, 4 12s, 10 6s, 12 3s, and an 8-inch belt. Well, you know, they had it for a class there, and they've really regressed. This is fast, yes. Well armed, reasonably so. Not spectacularly, but it's got the main guns at least. But significantly under armored, really. So, why? The AI hardly ever armor ships well enough, in my opinion. I mean, maybe I'm just crazy, but I really don't like to build battleships with less than a 12-inch belt if I can help it. And I don't put 6-inch belts on my battlecruisers either, which the AI loves to do. And that's why they explode so much. So anyway, France, 24 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 291,000 tons, just barely more than Italy. They've got 3 Libertés, 13,600 tons, 18 knots, 2 12s, 4 8s, 8 6s, 11-inch belt. You know, it's really not bad. Well, it's not good either. It's fast. It's pretty well armored. I don't understand why it's got 2 main guns. I would rather just have 4 12s and 8 6s, I think, than this. It's like almost an attempt at making a more semi-dreadnought type thing, but way too earlier on not enough tonnage. It's just not working out armament-wise as a compromise. 3 Suffren class, 12,100 tons, 18 knots, 11.5-inch belt, 212, 48, 85. Same problems, except worse because it's 1,500 tons lighter, and so they've added half an inch of belt armor, but they've also just cut the armament down to something that's really pretty damned anemic. I mean, they've cut the 6s out, so it's just really weakly armed for a battleship at this point. It's just, the calibers are fine, but it's just not got enough guns. Then 5 Voltaire class, 10,500 tons, 18 knots. Okay, well, 18 knots. Yeah, 10-inch belt, 410, 8683. I mean, it's another one of these. Well, the speed is good. The armor is really not that bad, but the armament is pretty weak for a battleship. So, yeah. 5 Flandre classes. Oh, sorry. 10,000 tons, 17 knots, 9.5-inch belt, 4 9s, 10 6s, 16 3s. Well, look, that's armored cruiser armament. It's not armored cruiser speed. It's not armored cruiser armor either, so this is another one of those that fits in a weird area where I just don't know what the purpose is, because it's definitely not fast enough to catch armored cruisers, and it's definitely not well armed enough, or really even well armored enough, to stand in a line of battle. So, what's the point? 4 Lorraine class, 12,600 tons, 18 knots, 4 12s, 8 6s, 8 4s, 9-inch belt. Well, reasonable armament, not spectacular, but reasonable. Good speed. The French have managed to actually almost standardize on 18 knots, or pretty close to it. So that's I think they've had a couple that are slower, but a lot of them have been 18 at least, which is pretty good. Kind of weak on the armor side, but not absolutely tragic. A reasonable ship, but not great. 4 Bairns, 15,300 tons, 18 knots, 412s, 16 sixes, 8 fours, and an 11.5-inch belt. Really not bad. Fast, well armored, very reasonable armament. The only thing I might like to see is, honestly, at this kind of tonnage, maybe up those, replace some of those 6 inches with, like, if it had 8-inch guns or something instead, or 10 8-inch guns, that would probably be more useful for capital ship actions, but it's not a bad battleship at all. Oh, and that's the latest of them. That's the last of them, though. So that'll take us over to Russia. 25 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 300,000 tons, of which 6 Imperatrice Ekaterina no, it's the Imperator Alexander the Third or something class, but apparently Alexander did not survive to this date. 12,000 tons, 15 knots, 4 12s, 8 4s, 12 3s, 11-inch belt. It's kind of slow. The armor is good. The armament is sort of barely acceptable. I mean, it's got the 412s, which is really the most important thing for a pre-dreadnought, but the secondaries are definitely quite anemic. I would call this a pretty basic but acceptable pre-dreadnought. It's very similar to my own Collingwood class, except honestly probably better, but well, the Collingwoods were faster when first built, at least. And then 2 Kinyal Suvorovs, which 9,100 tons, 18 knots, 9-inch belt, 4 10s, 6 6s, 10 2s. They're fast, but they're not well enough armored or well enough armed, really. Another case of slower than armored cruisers, and might struggle to beat up armored cruisers, honestly. 5 Andrei Pervolsvanys, 11,900 tons, 17 knots, 4 12s, 8 4s, 12 3s, 10.5-inch belt. Reasonable speed, reasonable-ish armor, reasonable-ish armament. There's nothing terribly wrong with this ship. It's just not really great on any front either, but there's nothing terribly wrong with it, so honestly, coming from the AI, high marks. 2 Imperator Pavel I, it's 10,100 tons, 19 knots, 4 12s, 4 6s, 12 2s, 7-inch belt. See, this is exactly what I was talking about. Fast, reasonable-ish armament, not great, but reasonable. Terrible armor for a battleship. More like an armored cruisers. Not good. And then 4 Lefort class, which sounds French, but okay. 12,000 tons, 17 knots, 4 12s, 10 4s, 23s, 8.5-inch belt. Okay, well this has, I mean, alright speed, alright armament. Again, nothing special. I mean, really, when was this built? 1901. You'd really be wanting some heavier secondaries than that by this point. You honestly always would, but especially by that point. And armor is pretty bad, so it's a pretty meh class overall. Well, with the armor, it's just kind of bad. Then 5 Paris class, 13,300 tons, 17 knots, 412, 14.6, 14.3, 9.5-inch belt. Speed is alright. Armament is pretty good, not spectacular, but better than the last one for sure with the heavier secondaries. Armor is also better, so it's straight up better than the, what was the last class called? The forts. These are definitely better, but still kind of under-armored, and still could probably use an even heavier secondary punch, given this is a 1903 class, but alright. And then 1 Evstafi, which was built only last year for some reason. 16,900 tons, 21 knots, 4 12s, 12 8s, 12 5s, and an 8.5-inch belt. I can only imagine they built this because they were lacking some critical technology to build an actual dreadnought. Perhaps several, because they're Russia. Because this has the speed of a dreadnought. It really doesn't have the armament of a dreadnought, but it does have a heavy, good semi-dreadnought armament. If this had been built in the proper built 5 years prior, this would have been quite nice in terms of armament. Built last year, it's kind of wild that they completed it. The armor, however, was always pretty bad, so I'm not very convinced by Evstafi, but she's quite a unique ship at least. She'll be a bit of a question mark for everyone in the world. And then the US has 19 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 198,000 tons. I think we did trim that a little for them. Though maybe not all those battles have happened yet. By this point in the war, I mean, as you know, the war is finished already, but by the point we're actually up to on the channel, but yeah. Anyway, 4 Montana class, 7,700 tons, 17 knots, 410s, 6.6s, 8.3s, 9-inch belt. I mean, speed's alright, but terrible armament. Pretty poor armor. Not a very good class. I mean, it's just straight up too small. You can't build a good battleship on 7,700 tons. Then they have 3, 6, 8 of the Wyoming class of 10,000 tons, 16 knots, 4 12s, 8 4s, 12 3s, 8-inch belt. Look, the speed is fine, really. Not good, but fine. Armament is fine, but also not good. Comparable to my early pre-dreadnoughts, but not as good as any of my later ones. And the armor is pretty bad, so I'm not very impressed by that class either. Then they have 6 of the Kentucky class, which 12,000 tons, 16 knots, 4 12s, 10 6s, 8 2s, 9-inch belt. Speed is still fine. They've pretty much fixed the secondaries. They're still not like anything exceptional, but they're pretty good now. Armor, still rather under-armored, but it's better. Like, they're getting there bit by bit. It's just these are 1902 battleships, so they don't have much time to get there, and they only have one other, which is Georgia. 15,100 tons, 20 knots, 4 12s, 16 6s, 12 3s, 9-inch belt. I don't know why this was built. This is a 1906 I mean, this is their last sort of... This should be well into the semi-dreadnought era, really. And it's about as almost as fast as a dreadnought, really. Just without anything like the armament of a dreadnought. Just a pretty standard, good-ish pre-dreadnought armament. And a pretty mediocre armor. So, like, it's probably their best battleship, but it's not... surely it is their best battleship. It's just not that good still. It's not anything special. So then we have ourselves. And we still have a fleet of 30 pre-dreadnoughts amounting to 480,000 tons. Now you'll note, compared to second power Russia, that's only 5 more hulls, but it's an extra 180,000 tons. We build big capital ships. Now our oldest 8, 9 even? Yeah, our oldest 9 ships are the Collingwood class, to be fair, which are not anything special. 12,500 tons, 16 knots, 4 13-inch guns, 6 5s, 8 2s, 14-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. These were legacy ships. And for legacy ships, they're actually quite good. Their main flaw is and always has been their very poor secondary and tertiary armament, which is quite anemic. However, their 13-inch guns, although now very old, always had pretty good punch to them, and their armor has always been quite good. The only problem is it's very old armament and armor at this point, but that does apply to the older AI battleships as well, so kind of cancels out in that regard. Overall, these are actually still not that bad. It's just they would really benefit from a heavier secondary armament, especially as destroyers are becoming more and more important now. But their belt is still very good, and their main armament with the 13-inch guns is still alright. I mean, well, okay, not in the Dreadnought era, it's not, but compared to other pre-Dreadnoughts, it still holds up. Then we have 3 of the small Hannibal class, which was my first self-designed class, I think, although... Finished 91? Yeah, I think it was still my own class, but I can't remember for sure. Maybe it was, Oh, I wouldn't have done a 10.5-inch belt, though, so... This was probably actually a legacy class that wasn't finished yet, I think, yeah. 15,000 tons, 17 knots, 4 13s, 10 6s, 14 2s, 10.5-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. I mean, faster than the Collingwoods. Much better secondary and tertiary armament. Honestly, I don't think it's actually better because the armor is not good enough for my tastes. But it's still not too bad by AI standards. So this isn't a terrible pre-dreadnought at all. I mean, speed is pretty alright. Armament is pretty good. Armor is not great, but yeah. Of course, these actually only make like 14 to 15 knots, these older classes by now, but that's true of all the old AI classes too. Then we had 8 of the illustrious class in the mid-1890s. These were designed by me. 16,600 tons, 18 knots, 4 12s, 14 6s, 23s, 11-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Pretty fast, pretty well armed, pretty well armored. There's not anything that really stands out about the illustrious class, honestly. But there's also nothing that stands out in a bad way about them. They are objectively better armored than almost all of the AI classes, although I probably would have wanted even more, but they're still one of the very best armored pre-dreadnoughts in the world. They're as fast as they need to be, faster than average even for a pre-dreadnought. And their armament is quite good. It's just not anything approaching semi-dreadnought, but it's pretty good. Then we have 6 of the London class from the late 1890s, which are 6, yes, 17,500 tons, 18 knots, 4 12s, 14 6s, 23s, 14-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. You will note the same speed and the same armament as the illustrious class, but I managed to pack on another 3 inches of belt armor. Well, I was just complaining about the illustrious belt armor. Obviously, I felt the need to compensate. And, well, I think basically when I designed the Londons, it was a choice between either trying to go for some kind of semi-dreadnought type super heavy secondary armament or going for a lot of armor. I went for a lot of armor. I don't really regret it. Its armament, its speed is good, quite good. Its armament is pretty reasonable, nothing special, but quite reasonable for a pre-dreadnought. And its armor is excellent, so the London class is not bad. Obviously, no pre-dreadnought will stand up well in the coming years as dreadnoughts become more and more common, but it is what it is. Our final class, the 4 Ramilliers, 21,200 tons, 18 knots, 4 12s, 12 8s, 16 3s, 13-inch belt, 3-inch deck. Fast, well armored, very heavily armed. Having just looked over all the AI designs, I am fairly confident that these are the most powerful pre-dreadnoughts in the world. Obviously, they will not age well into the dreadnought era. They are already outgunned by pretty much every dreadnought. But against pre-dreadnoughts, they're pretty damn nice. I mean, the 8-inch supporting armament plus the armor and the speed, yeah. The Ramilliers class is very nice for a pre-dreadnought, I would say. Just also very expensive, but I was probably building them later than I really should have, but I didn't have the tech for dreadnoughts yet, so those 4 came into existence, and I don't really regret it. And so now that will bring us to what you probably have really been waiting for. The dreadnoughts. We'll actually start with the battle cruisers, but the dreadnought ships of the world. Now, as I said before, there's only, 7, 9, 15, 20, 23 battle cruisers in actual existence in the world. Spain has 0. They are building 2 ships of about 20,000 tons. They are not yet finished. Austria-Hungary has 0. They are also building 2 ships of about 20,000 tons. They are not yet finished. Japan has 5, which is equal second in the world. That's not 185,000 tons because they have 5 more building for some reason. But they do have, 60, about 80,000 tons of battle cruisers in service already. The first 4 are the Tsukuba, Kuramahi, and Haruna. 15,700 tons, 23 knots, 4 12-inch guns, 10 5s, 10 3s, and an 8.5-inch belt. That would be the immediate flaw with these. These are not technically actually really battlecruisers, because they, well, technically they do have an all big gun main armament. They just only have 4 big guns. They straight up don't even, usually the trick in the early area is cross deck fire or wing turrets or something like that that is not very efficient. They straight up just only have the 2 twin turrets. So, in fairness to them, they are considerably fat. They will still do the original role of a battlecruiser, as in, they will very much hunt down and kill any armored cruiser that was afloat at the time they were launched. They're faster than any of the old armored cruisers by a couple of knots, to be fair. They're not anything special by battlecruiser standards. And their armor is pretty decent by battlecruiser standards, although not anything spectacular for a capital ship. The only problem is that they're only halfway along the evolutionary chain to the real battlecruiser, and when a battlecruiser with 8 12-inch guns pops out, they're going to be in big, big trouble. Now, they did follow that up with Icoma more recently, which 18,800 tons, 24 knots, 8 12s, 10 5s, 12 3s, 8-inch belt. Obviously, 4 twin 12-inch turrets with cross-deck fire. This is a much nicer and more stable battlecruiser. I wouldn't put so little armor on a battlecruiser, but it's pretty alright by what the AI tends to put on battlecruisers in the early era, so speed is pretty good too. Armament is honestly pretty alright. Just the cross-deck fire, but that's what you expect from early battlecruisers, so Icoma is pretty decent. Just it's a shame they built 4 of these Tsukubas immediately before that are really not going to age well. Then Germany also has 5 battlecruisers with 2 more building, amounting to a little over 100,000 tons in actual service. These are all of the Goben class: SMS Goben, Lutzau, Seblitz, Moltke, and Derflinger. 21,700 tons, 24 knots, 8 11-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, cross-deck fire, 10 6-inch, 16 3-inch, 9.5-inch belt. Honestly, it's unfortunate because I'm at war with them and I don't really have a counter, but they've done a pretty bang-up job with these. Granted that they're forced to use cross-deck fire, but the armor is pretty decent for a first-generation battlecruiser. The speed is good. The armament is really pretty good. I mean, 8 12s would be better, but 8 11s is not, like, horribly worse. And it's very German. So the Goben class are pretty fearsome at the moment, and really quite a decent first effort at a battlecruiser. And unfortunately, they've very much been causing us problems in this war, but we did win this war anyway, as you probably all know, so yeah. They're also building Hindenburg and Mackensen, which are slightly larger designs, but they won't be finished for a couple of years yet. Now, Italy has 3 battlecruisers in service with 4 more building. These being about, 51,000 tons total, quite a lot less. Paolo Emilio, Opio Traiano, and Claudio Tabirio. 17,000 tons, 23 knots, 4 12s, 10 5s, 10 3s, 8-inch belt. I mean, they're pretty much the same as the Japanese design. They're actually a little slow for a battlecruiser. Still fast enough to catch earlier armored cruisers, but yeah. Armor, nothing special, but nothing really, really horrific. Armament, however, just straight up not 8 guns. Just 2 twin turrets, pre-dreadnought style, so these are really only half battlecruisers, and I've seen a lot of these around, actually, from playing before, so I don't know why the AI really wants to do that, because they're just problematic. They will really, really, really age poorly. Let's put it that way. France has 2 battlecruisers in service with 2 more building. Oh, Italy has 2 more Paolo Emilios plus 2 slightly larger Umbria and Pisa building. Now, France has 2 battlecruisers of the Dunkirk class, about 36,000 tons worth, 17,900 tons, 25 knots, 4 12s, 2 twin turrets, 14 6s, 12 3s, and a 7-inch belt. They are fast, quite fast, which will be a bit of a saving grace for them because their armament is bad on account of only having 4 guns, and their armor is pretty poor as well. So the Dunkirks are really not very good, and even if the Germans didn't have 5 Goulbens to the 2 Dunkirks, the French would still be in big trouble comparing the two designs. What are these? Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Then the Russians have 2 battlecruisers in service with... Did I skip anybody there? I got Spain, Austria, Hungary, Japan, Italy, Germany, France. Okay, we're good, I think. The Russians have 2 battlecruisers in service with 4 building, amounting to about 32,000 tons in service. 1, Kinburn, 15,400 tons, 25 knots, 4 11s, 10 5s, 12 3s, 6.5-inch belt. Look, they're fast. They have a really terrible armor belt, and they're really weakly armed. Not only do they only have 4 guns, but they're only 11s as well, so Kinburn is really quite bad, except for being fast. And then they have Ismail, which is 17,800 tons, 26 knots, 6 11s, although... Oh, it's a midships turret. 14 6s, 12 3s, and a 7.5-inch belt. Look, it's even faster, it's a bit better armored, and it's got a 3rd turret, so it's a lot less bad than Kinburn. In fact, if it had the 4th turret, I would say it's not that bad, and maybe even kind of good. But it doesn't, so it's still really gonna age pretty damn poorly. It is very fast, though. That will be its saving grace for a little while. And they're now building 3 Navarans and a Fokshani, which are all over 20,000 tons, so those will probably be better designs, but we'll see. And now the USA has the largest battlecruiser force in the world currently, with 6 ships in commission and 4 more building. These ships in commission are on the smaller side, amounting to, 34, 68, 102,000 tons altogether, I think, which actually does make them a bit less tonnage in service than Germany, to be fair. And just much worse, actually, because USS Saratoga, Lexington, Constellation, Constitution, Ranger, and Congress, 17,000 tons, 25 knots, 4 11-inch guns in 2 twin turrets, 14 6s, 10 3s, and a 9.5-inch belt. Look, they're fast. Their armor is actually pretty good. 4 11-inch guns really does not an actual battlecruiser make. These are gonna... They're pretty terrifying right now, because there's very, very few actual 8-gunned battlecruisers to fight them. And they will absolutely tear armored cruisers apart, still. Although not nearly as well as an 8-gunned battlecruiser would, but still they'll have the better of any battlecruiser around, or armored cruiser around. I guess they'd better, because they're almost twice the displacement of most of them. But, although some of those proto-battle cruisers that people have, like this will lose, but not even by that much to one of those. Let alone, like, the Japanese had some even bigger ones, didn't they? Like this? It doesn't have enough armor, but some of these bigger armored cruisers that exist are not that much worse than these weird, weak battle cruisers. Like, close enough to give them a bit of a fright, probably. But that's where they're at. They've got 6 Saratogas in service. They are not going to age well. And finally, us. We are definitely behind here, as we have 0 battlecruisers in service, amounting to 0 tons, which is the same as Spain and Austria-Hungary. Although we do have actually 4 building of the Indomitable class, which will be 28,100 tons, 27 knots, 8 12-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, albeit only one of them is actually super firing, 12 5s, 10 3s, 11-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Look, when completed, the Indomitable class will be the strongest class in the world. They will definitely beat the German Goldwins one-on-one. They have a larger gun caliber and no cross-deck fire, even if it's not perfect super firing, and better armor and speed. So they're quite nice. Just, they don't exist yet. and won't for 2 more years, which is a bit of a problem, to say the least. That being said, that's the battlecruiser situation. So really, only out of all of the world's fleets, the only actual battlecruisers in service anywhere are Ikoma in Japan and the 5 Gulbens in Germany, with everyone else currently using 4-gunned battlecruisers. Now, there are definitely a lot more 8-gun battlecruisers under construction right now. Probably all those over 20,000 ton designs should have 8 guns, but we'll see. And all these 4-gun ships that exist right now, they're really, I mean, this little window of a couple of years right now, they're pretty strong still. But by like 1915, certainly by 1920, they'll be essentially useless. As soon as there's a sufficient number of 8-gunned battlecruisers in service, they will be going the same way as the armored cruisers, which also will have to be decommissioned fairly soon because they're becoming pretty vulnerable until proper fast heavy cruisers are built. Anyway, that brings us on to the dreadnoughts, of which there are 19, 21, 22, 25, 29 in service, that's right. Everyone does at least have at least one dreadnought in service, including Spain, which has 2, amounting to 35,000 tons or so. Rey Don Francisco de Assis is 16,600 tons, 18 knots, 8 12s and 4 twin turrets, cross-deck firing, 18 5s, 4 2s, 8.5-inch belt. Look, it's not really enough armor. It's not really very fast for a dreadnought. But you know what? It's got 8 12-inch guns. So I will count that as a win for Spain. And call it good, even though it's objectively not very good, but the bar is kind of on the floor for them, so I'll take it. And then Mendez Nunes, 19,200 tons, 23 knots, 8.5-inch belt, 8 11s, 10 4s, 16 3s. Well, it's got the speed of a dreadnought, or better even. Armor's still not very good. Armament, still cross-deck firing. And also only 11-inch guns, but could be worse. Not a very great secondary armament either, but not terrible. So, it's not a hopeless design, it's just not that great. Austria-Hungary also has 2... Oh, and they're building 3 more ships, all of over 20,000 tons, so they're coming along. Austria-Hungary has 2 ships in service of the Steiermark and Budapest, 17,600 tons apiece. 20 knots, 6 12s in 3 twin turrets, 18 5s, 9.5-inch belt. Well, they're not that fast for dreadnoughts, not that slow either, but not that fast. Their armor is not that good. Their armament... If you really had to do a budget kind of dreadnought, this is not... At many angles, this will be effectively equal to a cross-deck firing ship with 8 guns. Because cross-deck fire really only works when you're broadside on properly. That being said, it still does not, just objectively does not have the 4th turret. And so it's not a very strong dreadnought class at all, let's put it that way. Now they're building... they're building 3 more battleships. 19,400 and 21,800. Let's hope they all have at least 8 guns. But they might not. The AI seems really prone to building dreadnoughts with not 8 guns. Which does make me feel better about being a little behind in the race, because some of these designs are very poor. Japan has 1 dreadnought in service, Nagato. 15,800 tons, 18 knots, 8 12-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, cross-deck firing, 18 5-inch, 4 2-inch, 9-inch belt. Interestingly, everybody who is fitting 8 guns on so far seems to be going for cross-deck firing and not wing turrets, which is a little weird. But, it's not very fast for a dreadnought. It's pretty poorly armored for a dreadnought. Its armament is acceptable, so I would call it bad, but not worthless. They're building another one of those and a larger Kaga of 19,000 tons. Now, Germany has 5 dreadnoughts in service, which is joint most with myself and Russia, and 2 more building, amounting to, well, that's 50,000 tons building, so 91,000 tons in actual service. 2 Vettins, 16,100 tons, 19 knots, 8 12s in 4 twin turrets, cross-deck firing, 24s, 4 2s, and an 8-inch belt. They're not very fast for dreadnoughts. Their armament is alright. Secondaries aren't spectacular, but are not terrible either, actually. So I would say armament is pretty good, albeit the cross-deck firing issue. Speed is bad, but not horrible. Armor is pretty weak, actually, which, you know, that's supposed to be Germany's trademark, but it's really not very great, so get your act together. That's Wettin and Wurth. And then 3 Von der Tans, Von der Tan, Bayern, and Württemberg. Interestingly, they're not using it for a battlecruiser. 19,700 tons, 23 knots, 8 11-inch guns, 10 6-inch, 16 3-inch, 9.5-inch belt, still cross-deck firing. You know, they're basically using it for a battlecruiser, aren't they? Well, it's quite fast for a dreadnought, but not super well armored. But really, these are quite nice, actually. I mean, they still have the cross-deck firing issue, and it's not a super heavy main armament with just the 11-inch guns, but they are quite fast. The armor's not really good, but I've definitely seen worse. I mean, my battleships would still definitely beat these in a fight, but these are fast enough to run away, too, though, which is almost battlecruiser speed, really. Slow for battlecruisers, but fast for battleships is kind of where they're at. Also, well armored for battlecruisers, poorly armored for battleships, so they're kind of in a weird position there, yeah. And then they're building 2 25,000-ton Weissenbergs. Now, Italy has 3 battleships in service, all Francesco Morosini, Enrico Dandolo, and Ruggiero de Loria, all of the same class. 17,100 tons, 22 knots, 8 12s in 4 twin turrets, cross-deck firing arrangement, 18 4-inch, 4 2-inch, 8-inch belt. Pretty fast, reasonably well armored, or reasonably well armed, poorly armored. And that does seem to be the trend. Pretty much all these first-generation dreadnoughts, mostly their speed is alright, some of them are not, but mostly that's alright. Mostly their armament is alright, but most of them are quite under-armored, in my opinion. And they're pretty much all using cross-deck firing. Kind of going budget, I think. They got 2 more of those building and 2 22,000-ton Regina Margaritas, which will probably be a bit nicer. Then France has 4 dreadnoughts in service. All of the Invincible class. Invincible, Huarguibri, Coron, and Solferino. 17,800 tons, 19 knots, 8 12s in 4 twin turrets, cross-deck firing, 16 6s, 4 2s, and a 10-inch belt. A little slow for dreadnoughts, but a pretty good armament. And alright-ish armor. I mean, not great, but alright-ish. Which is better than most of the AI can say, so I'd be pretty happy about this French design if I were them. I mean, could definitely be faster, though, but with a battleship, if it's going to have one weakness, I'll probably take it being a little slower than average over it having a weak armament or armor. Not that its armor is great, but They're building 1 more of those and 2 23,000-ton Charles Martels and a 23,000-ton Jena. Well, it says 1 building, but they clearly have 4. They just must not be able to pay for all of them right now. Then Russia has 5 in service and is building 6, which is quite a lot. They have 3 Sviatitelia, Imperator Nikolai I, Cesarevich, and Dvenedstad Apostolov of their first class, which are 16,100 tons, 18 knots, 8 12s, 18 5-inch guns, 4 2-inch, and a 7.5-inch belt, which makes them rather slow and quite weakly armed. They're very weakly armored, that is. For a battleship, very weakly armored, really. Armament's alright, though. I would say these are pretty bad for dreadnoughts, honestly. I mean, for meeting the qualification to be dreadnoughts and that they have the 8 12-inch guns, they're pretty bad. Then they have the one-off Kreml, which is 19,300 tons, 21 knots, 10 12-inch guns, 10 3-inch, 9-inch belt. Well, 5 twin turrets with the wing turrets, so a proper dreadnought arrangement. Good speed. Armor below average, but not horrible. Well, pretty bad, but you know. 10 3-inch guns, pretty weak secondary armament, but otherwise much better than their first effort. Not a bad design at all. And then they're building, well, they have one Gangut, Colm is completed, and they're building another 4. This is 20,000 tons, 23 knots, 10 11-inch guns in 5 twin turrets with the wing turrets, 12 5-inch, 8 3-inch, 9.5-inch belt. Even faster than their previous design, and a bit heavier armored, but less gunpowder. Not sure it's really an improvement. If I was going to cut the gunpowder, I would have put it into armor. I don't feel like a dreadnought of this generation really needs 23 knots of speed, but, well, it's kind of pushing cruiser speeds at that point, but that almost just puts it in an awkward position. So, I don't know. It's not terrible, though. Not by any means. It'll be an effective dreadnought, at least. And, yeah, they've got 5 more of those building, and a 22,000 ton Sisoy Veliki. Then we have the United States. 2 dreadnoughts in commission only. 34,000 tons between them. Alabama and USS Alabama and USS Michigan. 17,100 tons, 19 knots. 8 12s in 4 twin turrets cross-deck firing. 25-inch, 4 2-inch, 8-inch belt. Speed is kind of meh. Armor is pretty bad. Armament is fine still. As a first dreadnought effort, it's kind of alright. It's not really very good. It's got the armament at least. It's not really got the armor or the speed. They are building 5 Idahos of 20,500 tons, which should be quite a bit better, and a 25,000 ton New Jersey, which could be quite a lot better. And finally, last but very much not least, Great Britain. We have 5 battleships in commission already, with 1 more building. Our first class, the Renowned class, since renamed the Jofu class effectively, with the lead vessel rechristened as HMS Jofu, but anyway. 26,000 tons, 21 knots, 10 12-inch guns in 5 twin turrets with the wing turret arrangement, 8 5s, 8 3s, 12-inch belt, 2-inch deck. It's got the right speed. It's got good armor, not spectacular, but, I mean, objectively, literally better than every single AI dreadnought that I just saw, so I should not be down on myself so much for that. It's pretty good armor. The deck I'm more worried about than the belt. But deck is still not as important in this era just yet, so should be fine. Overall, between speed, armor, and armament, this is definitely one of the better dreadnoughts around. Possibly the best, really, at this stage. The only real short point is the secondary tertiary armament is not that great, but for a first dreadnought effort, this is actually quite good compared to what literally all the AI countries built, really. And we've then followed that up immediately with the Vengeance class. Ours are HMS Jofu, Glory, Royal Oak, and Irresistible. And then we have HMS Vengeance, newly commissioned with Russell under construction. Only 2 of them. We might build more. Probably not ever, actually, because we haven't yet, as of when we're actually ahead in the campaign, but, you know. 27,600 tons, 21 knots, 9 12-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, which is a much nicer, a much more efficient arrangement weight-wise, shall we say. 16 5-inch, 8 3-inch, 13-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck. Same speed, functionally a better armament because it's actually a 9-gun broadside. Although one less barrel total on the ship, it's now a 9-gun broadside rather than the 8-gun broadside of the Jofu class. And better secondaries and better armor. So for 1,600 tons more, an extra gun barrel of the main guns, better secondaries, better armor. I'm much happier with the Vengeance class overall. And it is interesting that we managed to get triple turrets onto such an early Dreadnought design. I think we are the first then, yeah. Definitely we're the first to use triple turrets on a Dreadnought. And so, wow, look at that. Exactly 2 hours as of right now. So, perfect, ready? Because we are done. That is the situation as of 1910. I hope you all enjoyed. Sea Lords, all the world's fighting ships, 1910. Hope you all join me in 1920 in probably a couple weeks. In the meantime, thank you all very much for watching. Hope you all have a nice evening. Next episode of the campaign proper will be out on Monday.